Paolo Bacigalupi's debut novel, The Wind-Up Girl, set in a postmodern Thailand rendered almost unrecognizable by rising seas and out-of-control genetic modification, was named by Time magazine as one of the 10 best novels of 2009. It also won the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. His short story collection, Pump 6 and Other Stories, was the best book of the year by Publishers Weekly. Shipbreaker, Bacigalupi's debut young adult novel, was a Michael L. Prince Award winner and a National Book Award finalist. His other books for young readers include The Drowned City, a sequel to Shipbreaker, Zombie Baseball Beatdown, a middle grade book about The Walking Dead, the national pastime, and tainted meat products, and The Doubt Factory, a contemporary thriller about public relations and the product defense industry, which was an Edgar Award finalist. Bacigalupi's latest novel for adults is The Water Knife, a near-future thriller about climate change and drought in the southwestern United States, published by Knopf. Lee Childs, author of the Jack Reacher novels, called it a spectacular thriller, wonderfully imagined and written, and racing through it will make you think and make you thirsty. So sit back, hydrate, and welcome Paolo Bacigalupi.
All right. Oh, look at that. Okay. Hi, everybody. I always get extremely nervous when I get up and stand in front of people, so if you notice me shaking, that's why. It's not actually palsy, it's just dead fear. Now I'm going to have to collect my thoughts. Thank you all for coming. It's really great to see you all. Yeah, no, seriously. That's good. It's very soothing to hear that. It makes me feel very petted. Okay, I thought I'd talk a little bit about my writing, about what inspired The Water Knife. I thought I'd read a little bit from The Water Knife and then answer any questions you might have about my writing, about your own writing, about anything you have knocking around in your head. So please be thinking about questions that you might want to ask. I guess I'd like to start by talking about what I write, which is sort of an odd thing to sort of continually be thinking about, but every time I sit down next to somebody on an airplane or whatever and we start talking, I say I'm a writer, they say, oh, what do you write? I say I write science fiction, they say, oh, I don't read that. And you're like, ow. But it's really interesting because you do have this moment where, for some reason, when you say the word science fiction, that brings down a major wall between you and the person across from you. And it's puzzling, clearly the symbol words that science fiction, represents in my head are not what the symbol words do in their head. I don't know, they get rocket ships, they get Barbarella, they get something. And it's a bad thing, clearly, because the wall comes down. I don't read that. And so what I found is that I'm constantly sort of looking for other ways to talk about what I write. I found that if I talk specifically about the topics that I'm interested in, that you can bring that wall down again, you can get it out of the way. If I say, oh, I write about genetically modified food and what would the world look like if Monsanto ran all the food supplies and if they controlled the world, people are like, oh, I read this book by Michael Pollan, that's really interesting. Oh, it sounds like you write something legitimate after all. You're like, oh, thank you, that's really nice of you to say so. Similarly with The Water Knife, if I say, well, I'm writing about climate change and this massive drought that hits the Southwest, I'm writing about a water war between Phoenix and Las Vegas, where they're fighting over the last supplies of the Colorado River. People are like, oh, hey, well, we're in a drought. Suddenly, people kind of get where you're coming from in a more sort of visceral way, or at least in a specific way, and so you get past Barbarella and rocket ships. But there are other ways to sort of talk about what kind of writing I do. And I've sort of played around with a bunch of those. Sometimes I'll say that I write broken futures. Sometimes when I'm writing young adult, which is the only other genre where you get that same response of, oh, I don't read that. It's just really, I write for kids, oh. Is that you can say you write dystopian fiction, which is the way that young adult dodges being smeared with science fiction words, which is sort of interesting, like one genre that's despised trying to stay away from another genre that's despised. But And I apparently sort of bathe in both of them. So I'll say, sometimes I say I write broken futures. Sometimes I write accidental futures, because most of the stories that I tell are set in futures that nobody wanted, but whoops, we slipped and we ended up here anyway. And you sort of take a look at what that new world looks like. Margaret Atwood has this really interesting way of ducking and dodging the whole thing by saying that she writes anticipations. Which I think is a really, really elegant way to sort of get to the core feeling of what science fiction does. I've sometimes said that I write extrapolations because that's actually the tool set that I mostly use when I'm writing science fiction. I look around at a trend, I try to identify trends that are important, and then I ask the question, if this trend goes on, if this trend becomes the most dominant trend, what happens to the world? You extrapolate out and you say, what does this world look like? How would it feel to live in it? Do we like it? Would we like to avoid it? But it's that process of extrapolation that I think of as being the heart of science fiction, and it's the reason why I say that I write science fiction, Bring the Wall Down with Barbarella. Lately, though, I've been thinking about another sort of way of describing what I'm obsessed with, because the thing about sort of saying I look at a trend and I extrapolate and I say, if this goes on, what does the world look like? The kinds of trends that I'm interested in seem to not be the trends that other writers are exactly focused on. William Gibson sort of famously said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And it's really, and that really is, that there's a lot of truth in that. And the problem is, though, of course, you're looking around saying, well, which part of the future is here? Is it ISIS in Syria, or is it a functional democracy in Norway, or is it, which part of the future is going to be more distributed? When I was writing Shipbreaker, a young adult novel, I focused entirely on the shipbreaking yards of Bangladesh because I thought that had something to teach us, which is that Bangladesh is a resource-scarce society, and that's where we dump all of our old ocean-going vessels, our freighters, our ocean liners, our oil tankers. But for Bangladesh, it's not a waste ground, it's actually a mining ground. They're a resource-scarce nation, and they treat our waste like mined materials, and it's a boon in its own sort of toxic way to be able to mine those ships. And so I thought, so if you're looking at a world with resource scarcity, here's the model. Okay, so let's make that more evenly distributed and sort of create a world that looks like that. But one of the things that really I've started thinking about a lot lately, about the kinds of things that I focus on, where my anxieties go, and the things that trigger me to sort of think, oh yes, this is going to be the story I want to write about, is I don't know if anybody's familiar with the concept of the black swan or black swan events. There's this really interesting book by a guy named Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and he talks about black swan events. And black swan events are those events which were not anticipated by history, essentially. They're events that come out of nowhere. There's this sort of thing that human beings do where we sort of treat our history as an indicator of our future. So if yesterday was a certain way, we expect that tomorrow will be a certain way. And it's sort of this narrative tunnel that we build for ourselves, which works really well in a lot of cases, but works really badly when you live in a really complex society with all sorts of distributed sort of influences. And so surprises can sort of come upon us very quickly. An example of a black swan is the 2008 financial collapse. Everybody's sort of like, yeah, of course the financial system is working. And then suddenly, boom, the entire world is in crisis. It's like everybody's looking around going, we missed something, what was it? Taleb often says that, the time to be really worried is when experts can assure you that everything is fine, because that's the indicator that they're feeling very complacent. It means they aren't looking around very much. There's also I'm going to take a drink here because I'm super parched, sorry. There's also a story that Taleb tells, which I think is sort of telling and interesting, and that's that he talks about a turkey on a turkey farm. And he says, now, every day this turkey gets fed. And so the turkey quickly comes to believe that people are the most amazing things in the world because they feed him, they care for him, and every day they make sure he's doing okay. And so that's, it seems reasonable. And every day that's true. Every day he goes and he gets fed and he says people are amazing. And over time he becomes increasingly convinced that people are amazing and they want him to be fed and they care about him. And then, of course, on the day before Thanksgiving, he gets a new piece of data. And the interesting thing about that moment, right, that moment where the axe is coming down on the turkey's head, he's saying, but wait. The thing about it, that moment was the moment when he had become increasingly confident of the world and the way it worked and who people were and what they were. And the moment when he's getting his head chopped off is the moment when he was actually the most confident that he understood his world. He had never been more confident that his world was safe and that people loved him and they cared about him. That was the moment that the axe came down. His maximal moment of satisfaction and security, that his internal sense of security was at its maximum. And then there's this surprise piece of data, right? Now, the interesting thing is that there's another player in that story, and that's the farmer, right? The farmer is not surprised by what happens on the day before Thanksgiving. The farmer has a completely different data set. And what I'm interested in is that gap between what we think the world is versus what's out there that we haven't been paying attention to or haven't noticed. What's the thing that's going to surprise us and catch us unaware? I tend to look around for those data points where people say, oh yeah, we're for example, well, human beings are really ingenious and adaptable, and so we'll always solve all of our problems with technology. And I say, is that true? Or, I look at something like an agricultural company saying GMOs are safe. And it's like, okay, in what cases? You look at something like glyphosate resistance as a gene, and it says, okay, it's safe and if you put it into corn, but what happens when we call it safe and we stick it into something like creeping bent grass, which is basically a golf course grass, which is a great idea. Glyphosate is an herbicide, and so you can make a glyphosate-resistant grass, and that means that you can spray the whole golf course with herbicide, and you get your perfect monoculture of grass, and it's really cheap and really smart. Problem is, a grass is very different from, say, soybeans. And so that grass actually manages to throw up its seeds, and they go all over the place. And what it really turns out you've created is a super weed. It's a weed that actually cannot be killed and in fact is a huge problem on public lands. And this actually did happen a while back. There was a company that actually did put Roundup Ready genes, glyphosate resistant genes, into a grass, and it was they ended up getting a huge fine for it. But there's this moment where it was like, oh wait, how we define safe. We didn't think about that though. We didn't think about super weeds. We were only thinking about human consumption, And those are the interesting spots where I'm interested in that gap between what we think we know and what might surprise us. And that's sort of the space that I'm most interested in working in. Which sort of brings us to the water knife. And when I was working on the water knife, I was already really interested in drought because you were seeing certain things happening even years ago on the Colorado River. You were seeing that Lake Powell and Lake Mead weren't refilling, that they were getting lower and lower. You were seeing that the population demands were increasing in the whole region. You were seeing these sort of numbers, and they didn't quite seem to add up or anything. But eventually, I decided I really did want to write a book about drought again and climate change after I'd written a short story, and I decided I hadn't done enough yet. And while I was doing that research, I went to a drought conference in Denver, and this was during 2012. Colorado had a terrible drought, and so there was this big drought conference in Denver, and I read about it, and then I went and crashed it. And it turns out there's no security at a drought conference. They just let anybody in. It's crazy. But so I go to this drought conference and I sort of sneak in and nobody cares, and it's like, okay, great. So I sit and listen to all these people talking about the economic impacts of drought and talking about, so you could have ag people talking and tourism people talking, but you're also hearing from people like sewage plant operators, and they were saying, yeah, we can't release treated sewage into the river because there's not enough fresh water to create a viable mix, basically. So they were in danger of poisoning rivers if they released effluent. So they're holding ponds, but their holding ponds weren't really large enough to hold the amount of effluent that they had. And so it was sort of interesting where these invisible connections to water were. Back when I was down in Texas in 2011, there was something similar where they were having these rolling brownouts because of their drought, and it was because they didn't have enough water in their dams to run the hydro turbines. They didn't have enough hydraulic head, basically, to spin the turbines. And so you saw this spot where water was power, literally, and at the same moment that they were running their air conditioners at max, they actually had too little energy for the grid. So you saw those kinds of interesting impacts from drought. But the thing that was really fascinating to me about being in that drought conference in Colorado was that after the conference, I cornered one of the people from Denver Water. And after they've talked for a long time about the massive impacts, they talked about not just the ski industry, but also the impact on tourism when, your forests are all on fire, and so the news is all about how Colorado is a disaster area or whatever. After all this talk about like the ag impacts and the tourism impacts and all of these other logistical issues, that I asked him, I said, so this drought's pretty bad, and so how long could Denver last if it kept having droughts exactly like this one? And he thinks about it for a second, and he's like, okay, well, he's like, I think we could go 5 years. We could probably last 5 years if we keep having droughts like this 2012 drought. And I said, okay. He's like, it would be bad. Like, it would definitely be bad. We'd all be on major water restrictions. There would be like real curtailment of industrial water use. All of the trees in Denver would be dead. But we could hang on. And I asked him, I said, well, so what are the chances that something like that could happen? And he looks at me and he says, well, it's never happened before. Now, as somebody who writes about accidental futures and disasters, this of course warms the cockles of my heart. Like, this is like fantastic. I'll give you a drought, sucker. But as a citizen, it's worrisome, right? You sort of want your public servants to actually be focusing on those risks, and the people who are in charge of actually making sure that you have water all the time. You kind of want them to be on the ball, and in that moment, where I'm thinking, oh my God, I have such great material for my fiction, I'm also thinking, oh my God, we're so fucked. And so that was sort of like that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about when I'm working on a book, and that's the kind of gap that I'm looking for, is that missed opportunity, that accidental future that comes because we weren't looking, or we didn't have the imagination, or we didn't somehow value the future risks enough, or we didn't assess those effectively. And I feel like fiction is one of those spaces where you can sort of pull this interesting trick of empathy. You can generate empathy for people whose skin you've never lived in before. You can connect people to, people who you would otherwise never be connected to. And in the case of science fiction, you can connect people to our future selves. We tend to discount our future selves. Who are we going to be in 30 years? Who knows? What life is our children? What life will our children lead? Who knows? You're really focused on this here and now spot, naturally, because we're in our skin, we're in our bodies, and this is our present moment. And this is where all the pressures are, right? We have to get to work, we have to pay our bills, we have to do certain things right now. So we always sort of emphasize our present selves and discount the value of the life of our future selves. And science fiction is sort of an opportunity to sort of pull a trick where you can actually give some weight to your future self and some value to your future self, because you get to live in that version of the future that we're building today. And so that's a lot of what I'm sort of interested in when I'm working with something like The Water Knife. So I think I'm going to read, actually, a small part from the book. So The Water Knife does take place in this drought-devastated future. It follows three major characters. There's Angel Velasquez, and he's a water knife for Las Vegas, and water knives are these sort of 007s of water. They go out and give people offers on their water rights that they can't refuse. They blow up other people's water treatment plants. They're sort of the people who get it done for Vegas and provide a certain amount of plausible deniability at the same time. So there's Angel Velasquez, and he has actually been sent down to Phoenix, where he is on the hunt for some rumored water rights, and also there's a water knife of theirs who's gone missing. And so he's on the hunt to try to figure out what happened exactly. And Phoenix the two cities are very different. Las Vegas has sort of made a lot of plans and anticipated that drought is coming, and so they've started doing a lot of things to conserve their water and to build these giant arcologies that hold water inside of them and always recycle it along with their waste. Whereas Phoenix sort of decided to try to whistle past the graveyard and didn't really engage with, how vulnerable it might be in a mega drought. And so Phoenix at this point is sort of falling apart. And so Angel goes down to Phoenix and he meets another character down there named Lucy Monroe, who's a journalist. And Lucy has been covering the collapse of Phoenix for 10 years. And so she's very much embedded in the place. She's sort of somebody, in her sort of dark moments, she describes herself as a collapse pornographer. She's, in that sort of same way that like when we look at photos of Detroit and you see the old buildings that are covered with vines and everything like that, it's like we seem to have some visceral engagement with things falling apart. And Lucy sort of feels like she's in this sort of space of documenting that, even as she's trying to write other stories that are more interesting to her, but are also of no interest to the public at all. And then there's a third character, and it's Maria Villarosa, and she's a climate refugee. She's fled out of Texas, which in this future has been destroyed by mega droughts and by hurricanes and by floods, and actually most of Texas is sort of on the move, and a lot of the southern United States is on the move. And this means that the states that are north of them have all started trying to put up border control laws and trying to control the flood of refugees. And so Maria has made it as far as Phoenix and sort of washed up there and can't get anywhere else. She can't get into California, she can't get into Nevada or Utah, and she's sort of stuck. And so she's stuck as this sort of second-class citizen in a place that's already falling apart. And so I'm going to read from Maria's perspective, and this is just a scene where she's at one of the relief pumps that have been sort of put around the city of Phoenix in different places to sort of provide water for refugees. There it is, there's the tension, right? Okay, so, all right. A ragged gouge cut the face of the Red Cross China Friendship water pump. Some kind of tool dug in. Furrowing carbon plastics like her daddy's plow had once ripped San Antonio dirt, except deeper and more angry. Maria wasn't sure who had attacked the pump or what they thought they'd accomplish. Fucking hell, that pump was armored. She'd seen a bulldozer bounce off its concrete defenses. That sucker wasn't going nowhere. It had been stupid of someone to try to cut it, and yet someone had. The price blazed through the scratched plastic. $6.95 a liter, Y for gongjin. Gongjin meant liter in Chinese. Y was for yuan. Everyone who lived anywhere near the Taiyang arcology knew that number and that cash because all the workers got paid in yuan, and the Chinese had built the pump too, because friendship, right? Maria had been learning Chinese. She could count to 1,000 and write the characters too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. She'd been learning the tones. She'd been learning as fast as she could from the disposable tablets that the Chinese passed out to anyone who asked. The liter price glowed in the hot darkness, blue and indifferent, blurry from the human anger that had been hacked into it, but clear enough. $6.95 a liter. Every time Maria saw the ripped face of the pump, she thought she knew the person who'd done it. Dios mío, she was that person. Every time she looked at the pump's cool blue numbers, she felt rage. She'd just never been lucky enough to swing a tool that had a chance of hurting it. You needed something special to make a cut like that. Not a hammer, not a screwdriver. Maybe one of those Yokohama cutters the construction crews used on the Taiyang back when her father had still worked there. They turn I-beams to dripping water, he'd said. Turn steel to lava, mija. You can't believe it. Even when you're standing right next to it. Magic, mija, magic. He'd shown her the special gloves he used to keep from slicing off a finger, glittering fabric that gave him 1.5 seconds before his hand disappeared in a puff of smoke. Magic, he'd said. Big science. Who cared what the difference was? The Chinese knew how to make things happen. Those cabrones knew how to build. The Chinese had money and they made magic happen, and they'd train anyone to use their tech who was willing to sweat a 12-12 shift. Every morning, as the sun was starting to turn the sky blue, Her father would return to Maria and describe the miraculous things he'd seen the night before while working on the high exposed beams of the arcology. He described the massive construction printers that poured solids into form, the shriek of injection molds, the assembled pieces being craned up into the sky. Just-in-time construction. They had silicon PV sheeting that they poured over walls and windows to generate power, dumped it on like paint, and next thing you knew, you were full electric. None of the rolling brownouts that hit the rest of Phoenix for the Taiyang. No way. Those people made their own power. They fed their workers lunch. I'm working in the sky, he'd said. We're all good now, mija. We're gonna make it. And from now on, you're gonna study Chinese. And we don't just gotta go north. We can cross the ocean, too. The Chinese, they build things. After this job, we can go anywhere. That had been the dream. Papa was learning how to cut through anything, and soon he'd be able to slice through the barriers that kept them trapped in Phoenix. They'd cut their way through to Vegas or California or Canada. Hell, they'd cut a path all the way across the ocean to Chongqing or Kunming. Papa could work the upper Mekong and Yangtze dams that kept water for the Chinese. He was going to build. With his new skills, he could cut through anything. Fences and California guardies and all the stupid state border control laws that said you had to stay in a relief zone and starve instead of going where God still poured water from the sky. A Yokohama cutter slices through anything, he'd said, and snapped his fingers, just like butter. So maybe it was a Yokohama cutter that they'd used on the Red Cross pump, but even that tool hadn't gotten them a drink. You could cut your way to China, maybe, but you couldn't cut your way to a cool glass of water in Phoenix. Maria wondered what price had driven the person to go after the pump. $10 a liter? 20? Or maybe it had only been $6.95, just like now. But to those people, $6.95, it seemed like their first Phoenix police baton to the teeth, something they just couldn't accept. Maybe those way back when people hadn't known that $6.95 was going to be as good as it got forever after. Didn't know that they should have been counting their blessings instead of taking a cut at the pump. All right. All righty. So there's one of the characters, and okay, and now I've done my part, so now it's your turn. If any of you guys have any questions at all, I'm happy to answer them. And so, yeah, anything about my writing, anything about writing craft, anything about science fiction, anything at all.
And we have a microphone to go around.
Okay, great. Hands? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you in the blue. Oh, I can also repeat questions too. So.
I remember reading your very first short story that was published, and it was so good. It was so excellent. You just seemed to come out of nowhere, in a sense, to the genre. It was like you rocketed in, and I think a lot of folks are going, "Whoa, who is this guy?" And I'm curious how you got into the genre and how you were so good so quickly.
How was I so good so quickly? Because I'm magic. No, actually what happened was I got really lucky because a bunch of my novels got rejected, and so nobody saw me learning. That's really what happened. I wrote 4 novels that didn't sell. I wrote for years. Pocketful of Dharma, I did sort of get lucky. I did write one short story that got published. It was my first short story ever, and it got published right away in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And I thought I'd learned something from that, and then I proceeded to get nothing but short story rejections for a while afterwards as well. But what it meant was that because I did all that learning in secret, when I started selling short stories like The Fluted Girl and The People of Sand and Slag and The Calorie Man, I had learned a huge amount by writing all of those other novels. And so there was sort of an impression that I had come out of nowhere, but mostly I was just suffering in silence and isolation. So, yeah, in the middle back there, yeah. Yeah, you. Okay. I'll repeat it. That's fine.
So I'm a fan and a middle school teacher, so all those milieus you talked about are just are just impervious to me, which is awesome. But I'm actually, this summer at my summer school job, I'm going to be teaching shipbreaker, which I'm really excited about, and I'm writing curriculum right now. So I'm looking for information about those anticipations that you talked about, or those extrapolations, ways that I can help my students connect shipbreaker and the world it exists in to the world today, and that the Bangladeshi shipyards that you mentioned was just like a gem, and I was wondering if you had more information about the real-world connections and inspirations
Sure,
for that.
Right, real-world connections and inspirations for Shipbreaker. Yeah, the first thing that actually really crossed my radar with that was I was watching a documentary about Edward Burtynsky called, I think, Manufactured Landscapes. And there was Edward Burtynsky is this really interesting photographer who sort of takes pictures of places that humans have completely altered, landscapes that have been completely altered, and he sort of works at scale. So when we change an entire landscape, when we dig a hole downwards, like the Kennecott copper mines or whatever, he'll go and take photos, and they're beautiful photos. Some of them are so beautiful, in fact, that environmental groups will use them as sort of demonstration of how devastated the world is, and at the same time, a mining company will use it as a demonstration of their excellent operations. It's very values neutral. It's just an extraordinary photo, and you can project what you will into it. But he went and he took photos at the Chittagong shipbreaking yards in Bangladesh, and it was really, really striking, and those images never got out of my head. So that was the first time that I'd sort of run across that. In terms of resources, though, there are numerous. I think National Geographic has done some stuff on shipbreaking yards. There's a bunch of different things now, and every once in a while, when I'm online and on Twitter, people will be like, "Oh my God, shipbreaking! It's real!" Like, they'll send me a tweet, and there's some new article that's sort of popping up, and it's like, yes, it is real. I just robbed from the present. That's what I do. But yeah, so there are some, the resources actually are out there, a lot of them. But National Geographic actually just recently did a bunch of stuff about shipbreaking, so that would be where I'd start. Yeah. Hi.
I am in an adult book group, but we read YA fiction, and we pretty much universally love you, that we read 2 of your books, and they sparked a lot of debate. In the passage that you just read, and then also I believe it's in Shipbreaker, you talk a lot about, it seems, sort of Chinese world domination, and I'm just wondering, sort of how you developed that interest, if you have a background in politics.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is about my world building, specifically about Shipbreaker and my YA stuff, but also connected to my adult stuff, is that oftentimes in my stories, I talk about China being a very dominant power in a variety of ways, and so what's up with that? So my background actually is East Asian studies. I was a Chinese language major when I was in college, and I studied Chinese and then moved over to China to work after I graduated. And I don't know, I think those things kind of make an impression when you're young. Like, I spent a bunch of time over there as a student, and then working over there was really powerful. And you could see China on the upswing. Every year you'd see China getting better. The first time I went there in '91, it was only a couple of years after Tiananmen, and it was, still very much a communist society. And then there were years later, I was back there, I think in '98 or something, and I was talking to somebody, something felt different about China, and you were sort of walking around trying to figure out what it was, like something's wrong, like something felt wrong. And suddenly you realize that everybody was smiling. That was a big change. Like, people's lives somehow had gotten better. They were like a little bit more head up. They were a little happier. Like, life was just a little bit better. And you could sort of see that transformation. But with my coworkers, I was working at this Chinese company, and we were having a conversation one day, and one of the things that really struck me was the absolute confidence that they had that China was on the rise again, and the cyclical idea of China having moments when it's really on top, and then moments when it sort of falls, and then it cycles back up again, that sort of dynastic circle that it goes through. And that, there's a strong sense of confidence that they were actually on the upswing out of the hole and into a new period of power. But there's something else actually that's really interesting to me about China, which is that it's kind of a get-it-done sort of place. They don't spend a lot of time on magical thinking. And so one of the things that's really interesting to me is contrasting that where, there may be all sorts of, it may be a, a controlling and power-hungry state in many ways, and the citizens may not have the kind of freedom we have in the United States at all. But in other ways, the country is driven by being reality-based. They're looking around all the time for what will destabilize us. They're looking around all the time for, how do we adapt to whatever's going on, whether that's that we need to get rid of our old state-run factories or whether or not they're going to deal with climate change or not. There's not a conversation in China about whether climate change exists. Whereas here in the United States, we cannot seem to get a grip on reality at all. And that's fascinating to me. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I wrote Water Knife also, was that Rick Perry, back when the 2011 drought was happening, the governor of Texas, back when the 2011 drought was happening, and he was a viable presidential candidate, was going around praying for rain. And Texas is in a massive drought, and here's their leader and a potential leader of the United States who's engaged in magical thinking, and you think, this does not happen in other places. And so one of the things I'm really interested in sort of driving home the idea that a serious data-driven and reality-based society will always win, and people who engage in magical thinking and internal conflicts like we have, where we just sit in stasis, we lose, and that's part of it too. So. When I went to college when I went to China in college, was that through Shanxi program? No, it wasn't actually, but it was through the East Asian Studies department. Later on, when I worked, I went over there independently rather than as an English teacher. Yeah. Oh, she's got a. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. So that's really interesting to me what you say about, magical thinking will bring down the societies and stuff. But in Wind Up Girl, they have a very strong emphasis on the religious aspects of the society and how they have like monks praying that the dams will hold. And yet, despite that, they seem to be doing more or less okay-ish.
Right. Okay, so this actually connects to another set of obsessions that I have about writing. One of the things that I'm interested in when I'm writing about a place like Thailand, when I was writing The Wind Up Girl, is that you kind of want to look at the place that you're seeing and see what seems to drive it and what seems to be important to it. And you kind of want to take those things seriously. So there are things where, from my perspective, I'm basically an atheist. But when I'm looking at Thailand, that's a place that takes Buddhism seriously. That's a place that takes things like ghosts seriously. That's the place that takes a lot of those other things very seriously. And so, when I'm going to write Thai characters, I'm not going to make fun of that or dismiss that. I'm going to say, this is important to them, therefore we're going to place these things in the story as markers of value and importance and reality, ultimately, for them. And it's just sort of, you're trying to reflect your character's state and space and their sense of what's important. So. In the back there, yeah.
So, I just finished reading The Water Knife. Thank you very much. I loved it, and congratulations. And my question, I finished it just before Houston started flooding.
Right.
And I do recall, just briefly there, you mentioned the scenario for the collapse of Texas having to do with both drought and the Gulf Coast being underwater. And it just made me think, gosh, I wonder if this author is going on book tour to Texas. So that's my question.
Yeah, actually, I'm not going to Texas. But I was in Phoenix, which I totally destroy in this story. And I was very warmly received, actually. It was very nice of them to take me in, even though I'm standing there going, yeah, and I totally wreck your city completely. It is sort of interesting to sort of see all of these sort of recent weather events sort of making you feel like you're just a little too close to reality. Certainly, the drought here in California has helped me a lot, and I really want to thank you all for that. No, Knopf actually put a huge amount into weather control in our marketing budget, and so I'm sorry, but it just had to be done for the book. But yeah, no, it's really, I mean, it is sort of interesting to sort of see these things happening, and then to see how personally people take it. One of the things that happened just recently was this person got on Twitter and just tweeted this storm of facts about how Las Vegas actually is the more wasteful city instead of Phoenix, and that Las Vegas is the one that should have died, not Phoenix. And you're like, okay, you win. Phoenix lives. Go for it. Like, you know. But so it is interesting how viscerally we'll take those stories in, and like, you know, you can either take that as a warning, you can take it as an entertainment, or in some cases people take it as an insult. And it's sort of interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, over here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so this is a question about the science fiction and, you know, and positive futures versus negative futures. When did dystopia become the default? And isn't it harder to write something positive? And in fact, shouldn't the project of science fiction be to create positive futures or positive myths that we can live into rather than creating these myths of destruction and suffering? Right. Okay. So yeah, this is really an interesting question to me, and I've thought a lot about it. The idea that science fiction, there's a couple of different modes that I feel like science fiction works in, and one of them is it does function, I think, as warning. You know, nobody looks at George Orwell's 1984, well, except for the U.S. government apparently, and takes it as a template for how you should behave. You know, and so you know, one of the things I do think a genuinely designed sort of broken future or dystopia or whatever, I think it has a very clear purpose to warn and to say, let's not go there. Most things that are labeled as dystopia, I don't think that they're any more purposeful than any other terrible future. You know, like, you know, when I look at something like the Hunger Games, I don't think it's going to teach me a whole lot. It's actually there for a thrill ride. That's what it does, and it does it very well. And so you create a terrible future so that you can have a thrill ride and have a sense of control over your destiny, which I think most high schoolers don't really have a sense that they have. So when you fight the man and actually win, I think that's as much of a hopeful future as any high schooler can ask for. But more seriously though. So on one level, I just feel like there is a place for warnings when they're built well and thoughtfully. I think there's a place for that. I do not think that we are earning a positive future at this point. We are hitting new records for the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and that's a bad thing. We are not, you know, when we talk about reductions in the amount of carbon we put into the air, we're talking about reducing to levels that are still terrible. You know, there's, you know, when we sort of like look at the data that like species are still dying off like crazy, we're still in a mass extinction period, basically. You know, there are not a lot of like sort of things where you say, like, if I take this long term, like, how does it look? And so I don't feel like we're earning a positive future. So in many cases, it feels very dishonest to say, oh yeah, there's a bright future out there. Well, if we started building one, I'd believe it. But there is this a question about science fiction as a myth that people live into, and this is really powerful to me. Neil Stephenson has talked a little bit about this, and I thought a lot about this when I was writing Shipbreaker, because I didn't want to write a really depressing story. I wanted to write an inspiring story for kids, while at the same time sort of being honest about the kind of future that we adults are handing to them. And so one of the things, though, that I did feel like science fiction does really well is it creates inspirational technologies. You see again and again in science fiction that a science fiction writer will conceive of something and then engineers go out and build it. And it's astonishing to see that happen. You see NASA scientists who talk about how they read about rocket ships and then they went out and created rocket ships. You know, it's very, very tight connections. You see this with Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, where he had the metaverse, and a bunch of computer science people looked at it and were like, that looks cool, we're gonna go out, and they built Second Life. And there are these very tight connections where the imagination sort of plants that flag out there as a guidepost for us to go towards. And so in Shipbreaker, even though the world is fairly devastated, I wanted to sort of point towards the idea of a sustainable future that looks cool as well. And so that's why I have clipper ships in there, which are, the world is devastated, oil has run out, but we have a new age of sail, basically. And so there are these beautiful clipper ships. They have high altitude parasails, they have hydrofoils, they're very fast, they're very sleek. And I wanted to make sustainable technology look seductive as, you know, an iPhone, or as seductive as a Maserati, you know, that this thing could be cool and sleek and awesome to have. Let's go build it. And that's, you know, I think that function exists in science fiction. I think it's a powerful function. And I think each author sort of decides how they wind that into their stories. So another question, right there in the back.
In your extrapolation from our current future to your black swan of the water knife, can you comment on corporate influence of privatization of water with like Monsanto, well, like with Nestle and
yeah.
Multinational banks right now buying up water?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some really interesting things about the idea of privatizing water because it's this fundamental thing, and it turns out when you, I mean, and Maria sort of has this run-in with what's the price value of water. It turns out it's very high if you haven't had a drink in a while. You know, it's interesting to sort of treat a commodity which is absolutely vital to life as also a profit center. And mostly I think it's troubling, but I think that you see again and again, you know, like, I mean, you know, capitalism is this really interesting engine where it's an engine for creativity, but it's also this, this engine for seeking sort of easy ways to make easy cash. It's rent charging sort of. And so when you see like water, private companies trying to privatize water, that's very much, they aren't adding a value per se. What they're doing is they're actually identifying a niche where they can insert themselves in as a new middleman. And I think that like, and that niche is actually sort of exacerbated by the fact that we tend to not invest in our government systems very well. One of the things I noticed in India when I was over there last was that you have these companies that are dedicated to providing clean water. There's all these, for the middle class, you can buy a water purifier for your home. And so what it does is it takes the responsibility and the need to invest in their central government solutions to having clean water and places that in the hands of the rich instead, and also creates a profit interest in having dirty water essentially, because then you can sell more water purifiers. So I do think there's some weird things where markets can do weird, distorted things and generate bad outcomes for the overall population. Yeah, here. Okay, last question.
So how do you deal with evil? I mean, if evil is a system rather than one villain or one group, how are you thinking about that? Like the farmer in Turkey, is he capitalism?
Okay, so how do you deal with evil? And how do you deal with the idea, like, is that I don't tend to, as a writer, yeah, no, actually I tend not to. I tend to avoid setting up stories where the good guys have the good values, the bad guys have the bad values, and now they shall do battle. Very often, actually, the way I set it up is that the evil was actually us now. We made bad decisions, and then we handed off this crummy future to everybody else. And they all just have to run around in it and try to survive in it. And they're going to have a variety of ways of solving that problem. So someone like Catherine Case, who runs the Southern Nevada Water Authority in the story, she's very clear-eyed. She's not very kind, but she's very clear-eyed about making sure that Las Vegas gets the water it needs. You know, you can call her the villain, or you can call her just smart, or but we aren't going to, like, you know, she doesn't exist in that space where you know, she's being selfish and wrong. She's just figuring out her way to survive, just as Maria is trying to survive down in Phoenix. And so you see all of these different characters sort of trying to find their point of solution, how they hold on to their humanity, how they lose their humanity when they're pressed. But the actual villains were us, handing them their terrible future and sort of narrowing their choices. Thank you so much for coming.